And now we're entering the next chapter of Google Search, where incredible AI features aren't just in search. Google Search is AI search, through and through. Now we're taking an exciting step toward this vision, where you'll be able to create and manage multiple AI agents for your many tasks right in search.
Welcome to the Center Edge. I'm Evan Swartztraber. Google recently had its developer conference, I/O, and there the company announced the most significant overhaul of search in its history. It's rebuilding the search box around AI, conversational queries, an AI mode that answers follow-up questions, agents that go gather information for you in the background, and interfaces the system generates on the fly. The thing Google described as the entry point to the web for 25 years is now being reimagined. That announcement set off a wave of commentary about the death of the 10 blue links, the idea that search is no longer a ranked list of websites you click through to, but a conversation with a chatbot with answers delivered to you directly, and AI agents even searching the web on your behalf. For a lot of people, that's a fundamental reshaping of how the internet works. So what does it mean for the people who actually make stuff for the web? Publishers, creators, anyone who depends on being found. They're not waiting to find out. They've already been bemoaning the drops in traffic from AI-powered search, where users' questions are answered without ever sending them to the source. And that lost traffic can also mean lost advertising or fewer subscriptions that pay for the work in the first place. Predictably, a lot of folks are now waxing nostalgic about the good old days of the open web. But were those days actually so good? People have been griping about this bargain for years, that Google scraped their content without paying, that it kept users on its own page, that it became an ad tech monopoly sitting in the middle of every transaction. The quote-unquote open web that everyone's mourning was a constant source of complaint while we had it, and at the same time, the AI companies make a real point in their own defense. They argue they could never have built these tools, now used by hundreds of millions of people, without access to that open web. For better or worse, ChatGPT probably doesn't exist if the web had been a closed, permissioned, pay-to-read place from the start. The same openness that people now are reconsidering is the thing that made all of this possible. So the real question is, what should the norms be going forward? When AI crawlers put enormous strain on a site like Wikipedia, who should pay for that? When a website says, please don't crawl me, and a company does it anyway, does that mean we need a new law? Or is a 30-year-old honor system good enough? If the old handshake between the people who make content and the companies that index it is eroding, what should the new one look like? And how do we even get there? Do we write new rules? Or does this whole thing just stay tied up in court for the next decade? My guest today has spent his entire career on these questions, these tensions between openness and control. Derek Slater is a founding partner of Proteus Strategies. He spent 15 years at Google. During that time, he built and ran its information policy team. And before that, he worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Harvard's Berkman Center, organizations that focus on tech policy issues. He's an expert on all these things. He's long advocated for the freedom to access and learn from information on the web. Derek, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Evan. Great to be here.
So I want to start with the history of how we got here, because scraping the internet is not a new phenomenon, right? As I mentioned in the intro, it's kind of how we have Google search. It's how indexing started. And maybe in your answer, you can help define terms for the non-engineers among us. But my very oversimplified history of events, and then you can tell me why it's maybe more complicated than that, is that around the time that search engines were coming online, right, late 90s, and becoming widely used, they essentially had bots that were scraping the web, right, going all over the internet, seeing what was on there, and then indexing it so that when people typed in a prompt into Alta Vista or Yahoo, or then, increasingly Google, which became 90% market share, they would be able to find it. And it was never a perfect bargain, and there was always complaints in both directions. But at the end of the day, there was some level of symbiosis. Google got to advertise against those searches, and publishers, whether it's a newspaper publisher, a cooking recipe website, or journals or whoever, they had the opportunity to either gain advertising from the visits to the website that Google would send them, or in theory, if they were subscription-based, someone would go and see a paywall and then sign up to read the article. That was essentially the handshake. Do I have that right, or is there more to the scraping history of the internet?
Yes. to both of those questions. Or rather, I think you get the broad strokes are right. I think it's important to underscore, as you have this tension of, I'm going to put up my website online. What is that? What is the bargain? What do you get to do with it? What do I get to control? Has always been contested, going back to the very beginning of the web, when people started to create bots, both for search engines and other sorts of data collection, to do research on the web, to analyze the web in various ways. And there were different problems that then came about from that. And we see echoes of that today. One problem was these bots, this was way before AI, right? This is 30 years ago, roughly 25 years ago. These bots are sending lots of traffic and they're overwhelming my sites. And what should we do about that? And their protocols were worked out to say, okay, tell me to back off. If you're overloaded, send me a signal to back off and I'll back off. And those sort of technical signals help mediate. Similarly, some people wanted to be indexed and, crawled in various ways, including for search engines. Some didn't. And as you indicated, that's where standards like robots.txt came from. These are, voluntary protocols that gave a site to say, hey, you can crawl my site, or you can crawl this part of my site, but not that part of my site. And again, with some of that issues of, how frequently and so on and so forth. And there were always tensions there that had to do with, competitive pressures, or rather, how much of the value are we sharing? Are you getting too much of the value? Should I get more of the value from that crawling? But also real sort of tensions around what should consumers be able to do with a site, right? If I come and read your website, should I be able to, use a assistant to help me find the little piece of it that I really want to read and block out the rest? Or should I have to read it with the interface that you provided full text? I say it that way because it's easy to jump from, and I think you did a good job of avoiding this, jump from, well, there was search and now we're here with AI and this is a total disjuncture. Along the way, there were lots of tensions. To give, a couple others to put into the mix. There were a number of companies that worked to try and crawl social media sites, both to analyze that content, but also to make it so that if I'm a user of Facebook and I want to read my Facebook posts with my Twitter posts in one combined interoperable interface, I could do that. And Facebook sued and said no, and Facebook won. And you can tell that a story of, well, it's their site, they have control, fine. Or you can tell it a story of, they shut out competition in the market for social media interfaces, leading to the social media world we have today, for better and for worse. Another example just to call out that I think is an interesting sort of intuition pump is ad blocking. On the one hand, I think there are people who say ad blocking is terrible. You should not use ad blockers. It deprives news sites of their revenue and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of consumers who use ad blocking because ads are really annoying, and we all find ads really annoying. And ad blocking is interesting because there's been litigation, there's been standards, and you can think of it as sort of like, how do we land at the right equilibrium? We're like, yes, there's ad blocking. It's just enough to make ads suck a little bit less than they otherwise would, but not so much that it erodes the revenue of news companies. And that's what I find really interesting, of like, how do we land at that equilibrium? And it's always a mix of norms, tools, laws, market changes. And that's where we find ourselves today with AI.
Yeah, it's depending on how old you are, right? You go to a news website these days that relies on advertising, and it may say you have to disable your ad blocker to read the news. And because I value journalism, and at this advanced age that I'm at of 34, I've learned enough. And I say, of course, I will disable my ad blocker. I want these journalists to get paid. There was a time when websites were almost unusable because of pop-up ads, right? And pop-up blockers were this incredible innovation that helped people avoid what was really awful web experiences in the late 90s and early 2000s. So to your point, there's been a lot of evolutions and debates throughout this past 25 years. Just briefly, I want to get a sense of how much this honor system has worked in the pre-AI era. We'll talk about some of the controversies in the AI era. But there's never been a law that says that a website's directions to a bot, right, or what they tell Google and Yahoo, et cetera, Bing, have to be followed, right? There's no law. There's separately copyright law, which we could get into later, but just if I say robots.txt, you're allowed to read my homepage and these sets of articles, but you can't read these other sets of articles, that is essentially an honor system. And much of technology policy and technology runs on honor system and protocols that You essentially rely on a critical mass of people to be good actors, and then we ostracize and shame the bad actors. But would you say, given your expertise and your history working on these issues, maybe like what percent of the time robots.txt was followed in the pre-AI era? Or would you say overall it generally worked that most actors in the ecosystem followed the rules, or was it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think here too, on the one hand, there was an equilibrium, right? We had an equilibrium where robots.txt existed. It's, you could use it to state, you can crawl me, but, you over here, I don't like you. You can't crawl me or crawl this part of my site, but not others. And that worked relatively, well, I think, in being able to give those signals. There were still, as you said, people who thought that doesn't go far enough. In the early days, there were websites that said in their terms of service, they said, you should not be able to deep link to my site, right? So that means you may only link to the front page, not to inner pages. And they wanted to legally enforce that. So those people clearly didn't think it worked. And as you indicated, I think as search grew, certainly the news industry, among others, had growing concerns about how much of traffic was coming to them versus how much was staying on Google or other platforms. And that led to a variety of different debates. So it's been, on the one hand, equilibrium and a standard that I think served people very well. On the other hand, always contested. And so when something then disrupts the nature of the equilibrium, all of those contestations then come to the surface. I think it's also important to look at it from the other direction of, the way robots.txt and that equilibrium did protect consumers, readers, people who use those websites, right? I didn't have to go and get your permission to say, I'm going to use this browser versus this browser, or I'm going to use this assistant to help me clip out the ads, or just, again, make the site something that is usable to me, accessible for me. Think if I'm, you're reading impaired. I can use something to do a speak aloud function on the web generally. It's important to note that's not true with everything, right? If you buy an ebook from certain publishers or in Amazon give publishers the right to say, turn off the read aloud function, even for accessibility reasons, right? So the freedom that we've had on the web, we didn't have in other domains. I'd say that's a good equilibrium personally. Others disagree. And I say it that way because robots.txt and these other sort of standards are now being recast actually as not just norms or, the sort of voluntary things, but things that should be legally required that you follow, or in case they're saying, it's already legally required. People are saying in litigation in these AI cases, robots.txt is already an access control or an enforceable directive or something else that people must follow under the law. So I think even they would contest your description of sort of the state of robots.txt, and that's what's playing out in these cases.
So let's talk about the traffic problem, because a lot of companies, whether you're a copyright holder or not, they're now complaining about the stress that AI training and inference is putting on their sites. And training is more about what goes into the development of a model like a Claude, like a ChatGPT, etc. Inference is what happens when I type in, tell me everything about this topic, tell me everything about Derek Slater, right? And it pulls up a bunch of your articles, and then it's inferencing the data set, it's inferencing the web, right? So both of those activities can stress a website. And of course, websites have to absorb costs when they have lots of visitors, right? Listeners might be familiar with just any sort of instance, viral moments where some relatively unknown small website gets a glut of visitors and it goes down. Is because they weren't anticipating that traffic. They didn't have the servers and the cloud capacity to handle it. And that's what also allows people to do things like denial of service attacks, DDoS, where you just like launch a bunch of cheap, essentially like hired hackers that you can get around the world to try to shut down a website, right? So these are maybe concepts people are familiar with, but now in the AI context, it's just bots, right? And you're seeing companies like Wikipedia, and which is the parent company, I guess, is Wikimedia. It's a nonprofit. They are not even copyright holders, right? So their complaint here is not that you're not necessarily paying me. Their complaint is that essentially their traffic is just becoming overwhelmed and they don't get paid for that. And in theory, when I visit Wikipedia to look at something, they show me a nice thing saying, would you please donate, right? At least there's a chance that a human being donates to them, and that's contributing to their mission. there's no way that these bots are going to read that message and decide to donate. The bots are not as bleeding heart, right, as maybe I or others are. So some of these stats are kind of staggering, right? They report that since January 2024, their bandwidth for serving multimedia, right, their image catalog is up 50%, and that's driven by scrapers. They say 65% of their most expensive traffic comes from bots, and it's only 35% of it is page views because some of it is just bulk collection. Then you have some open source projects saying that close to 100%, like 97% of their traffic is AI crawlers and providers like iFixit, which helps people do DIY, right to repair type stuff. They've sounded the alarm on this as well. So it seems like something in the social fabric, right? The contract, the protocols that have been developed over time that you referenced to try to prevent these sorts of stresses is breaking down. And these websites might look at this and say, these AI companies are worth trillions of dollars. They have virtually unlimited access to venture capital, even startups in AI, right? If you have a viable idea, you can go grab billions of dollars out of Silicon Valley. Not that difficult, it seems. And they're going to put the burden on me to pay for activities that they're engaged in that make them rich and I get nothing, right? And I think you're starting to see a lot of frustration. Is there anything, is it as simple as that? I mean, if you're Wikipedia, how is it not as simple as you're asking me to pay for you to become a trillionaire?
Yeah, I think, and I think you started to segment this into two different buckets. I think one part of this conversation is generally about sort of commercial websites, larger websites that take a step back. As you said, we've long had to deal with traffic of various types, some desired, some not, right? Some that will behave well and follow robots.txt. Some might be a DDoS attack. And so there have always been tools to try and, segment the different types of traffic. When it comes to, I think, commercial players, this traffic issue is bound up in a broader, again, value share discussion. It's not unlike your favorite subject, net neutrality, Evan, where, you're using my pipes. How dare you? Right. And, it's an interconnection issue in that way. The Wikimedia one, I think, is, and I'd say more broadly, the long tail of the web is both very interesting and a bit more complex, because I think when you look at a Wikimedia, they're not looking at being profitable, revenue generating. This is about sustainability, right? If you talk about a small website or these open source repositories or OpenStreetMap or libraries, cultural heritage institutions, this isn't about, you're a trillionaire and we want a quarter of your profits or something. We want to keep our servers up to keep fulfilling our mission of access to this content, right? Libraries, Wikimedia, they say our content is free, right? Wikimedia says our content is free, our infrastructure is not. And, that's not just a Wikimedia problem. It's something that I think, a lot of different folks in the public interest community, in the consumer rights community that I spend a bunch of my time on, where generally, it's about, we want open access, we want open content, to take this very seriously and say, but this has to be sustainable. How do we make sure this sort of information production and distribution is sustainable? And I think the paths forward there build a bit on the past. Some of it is new tools for sites to manage their traffic. Sites have always, generally had ways to rate limit different folks or to block, a DDoS attack, but new ways to sort of detect that traffic, rate limit it, move it around. And there are companies like Cloudflare and others who are providing a range of tools to do that. I think it's also, when you look at Wikimedia, one thing they've done is develop services specifically for bulk and high volume users. To say, like, instead of just, fetching content directly from Wikimedia, use this API, which you're going to pay for, but it's going to have the data structured in a way that's better for you. We'll be able to manage the traffic together. It'll work better all around. And, Google started, I think, in that a few years ago. A bunch more companies, including AI companies, came on board this year. And I think, that is a direction to try and make all this sustainable. And groups like Creative Commons, Open Future, they're talking with other, variations on this theme, Cultural Heritage Institution, other repositories. How might that model scale? And not everybody's going to be Wikimedia and have Wikimedia Enterprise, but how might we create that sort of different lane for the bulk or high volume user? And the final piece of the puzzle that, not without its complexities, is identity standards. So, giving people ways to say, hey, I'm a well-behaved bot. Maybe you go and get credentialed by some third party that says, yes, we agree, you're running a good bot. And, sites can say, if we only are going to let you into this part of the site, or at this rate limit, if you signal this, or maybe some greater form of identity. These are things that are actively being discussed in the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the home for robots.txt and a number of these other sorts of relevant standards.
I want to talk a little bit about Cloudflare before getting into some of these stealth crawler issues. I mean, they're related, of course. In your answer, if you could explain why Cloudflare is important and what they do, that would be helpful. But essentially, as I understand it, they're this very important company that sits at the layer between, a visitor to a website and the website, right? And they help websites essentially manage traffic, avoid cybersecurity attacks, avoid DDoS attacks. They're very important in the infrastructure layers of the internet that are not consumer facing, which is why people may not be familiar with them. And they've become a very significant voice in the debates that we're having on today's show, because controversially, right, they have this power, right? They have this huge market share. They're a very widely used company, and they see what's going on with the scraping, which they view as a problem in terms of cost shifting. But they also philosophically seem to believe that people should be paid for training on data and inferencing of data, which is, of course, a controversial topic that we'll get into the copyright debates and whether AI training should be quote unquote fair use, so non-compensated, or they should be forced to license content from copyright holders. But they decided to turn on blocking by default, which affects some huge percentage of the web. And many might see, great, right? These otherwise powerless publishers who are being inundated by AI scraping now have someone automatically putting the decision in their hands to say the blocking is on, you can unblock it if you want, and that gives you a point at which you can force a negotiation from the AI company if you believe your content is valuable, right? So maybe if I publish one Substack article ever, right? I've done one so far. I turn on AI training because for me, the idea of someone finding it on an AI bot is good for me, right? Because I have so few users. But let's say I had a very valuable catalog with lots of subscribers. I don't want people summarizing my content without them paying for it. I might say, yeah, Cloudflare, turn it on. And now someday, hopefully Anthropic or OpenAI comes to me and says, Evan, your content is so valuable. We'd like to negotiate. We'd like you to turn off that blocker. Right? A lot of folks see this as giving agency to people who have no agency. Others have argued against this, including my good friend Luke Hogg at FAI, folks at Public Knowledge, who I'm very friendly with. So, kind of bipartisan thinkers on these topics have said, this is creating like a gatekeeper effect. This is creating a toll booth. It's undermining the open web. So when you look at this, right, is Cloudflare taking this action? They view it as giving agency. Of course, it also helps them financially, right, because they provide this service. So it's good marketing for them. You look at this. How do you view this tension between, giving agency to content holders versus the potential downside of closing off the web? Like, how do you look at this situation?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we've always had paywalls, or we always had ways of where you can put your site behind a password and block it off from people. There's nothing inherently wrong with a webmaster deciding to do that, right? Different strokes for different folks. That's fine. Where things do get, I think, trickier are, you were suggesting, where these decisions get intermediated, or where people have a significant amount of bottleneck power in the ecosystem, such that it's not that they're necessarily empowering the webmaster to make decisions. It's they're tilting the playing field to favor themselves, to hurt with harmful unintended consequences in ways that hurt consumers. To be more specific there, right? Like if somebody wants to turn on the equivalent of a paywall to crawl their site, Cloudflare is this pay per crawl, nothing inherently in principle wrong. It's the in practice. If in practice, Cloudflare gets a cut of that and they have a significant market share and they want to then steer people into pay per crawl, well, that starts to make things more complicated. If they set the defaults such that the Internet Archive or Common Crawl or other sorts of public interest repositories are, blocked without the webmaster even really knowing, that's less okay. I mean, maybe some people want to block the Internet Archive, but there are lots of cases where people are like, oh, my webmaster just turned this on and we didn't mean to block you. And finally, I think it leads to some hard discussions of, yes, webmasters, they need agency, controls, different sorts of business models, fine. But where does your right as a webmaster, as a publisher end, and my right as a reader begin? Right? Again, we had a world before where, physical books where I own the book, I own a copy of the book, I can rip it apart, I can loan it out, I can sell it, I can use it as a pillow if I'm laying in the park. I can even privately perform it for my family in my living room if I want. I can read it aloud. Ebooks don't work that way. That is a function of law, fundamentally, and technology, but law. And so these are choices we get to make about how we want the web to work.
So getting to the stealth disguise problem, because I think this gets at the heart of whether codification is necessary, right? You brought up this notion earlier that some of these standards, some of these best practices over the years, some folks now want to start making laws about them because of what they see as bad actors who don't participate in the voluntary system. And maybe some of these bad practices are being incentivized by the competitive pressure, right? The race to AI, this existential fight for market share to achieve artificial general intelligence, right? The super intelligence that's going to rule the universe, right? That everyone's kind of acting crazy right now because of that, and that norms go out the window. And this does not apply to everybody. And I'm not even saying that these allegations are 100% because Perplexity disputes them. But August of 2025, Cloudflare, right? They're going to come up a few times on this show, right? They published an investigation essentially saying that Perplexity, which is an AI search engine that uses a bunch of different models. Listeners might be familiar with it, but they're basically trying to compete with general internet search. And I've used it. It's a good product. They essentially, the allegation from Cloudflare, right, is that publishers or content holders had sent the robots.txt saying, do not crawl me, to block Perplexity's bot specifically. And Perplexity then sends a bot that's pretending to be a human, right? That's disguised as essentially Chrome browser, right, which is used by humans on a Mac, right, used by humans. And they rotated IP addresses to dodge detection, sometimes straight up ignored the robots.txt, right, which requires the bot to fetch it, right, to acknowledge that its existence is part of how that works. And they said they essentially did like a sting operation to catch them, right, by saying block all bots, and Perplexity still got through. Now, Perplexity called the report a sales pitch. They denied the traffic was theirs, whatever. And then Cloudflare said, OpenAI, as a counterexample, they did the right thing, right? They listened to the instruction. So let's just assume that this is happening, whether in this particular case or not. Let's assume there are bad actors out there that are stealth crawling. And I've talked to publishers who say that this is a huge problem, right? That there are essentially stealth crawlers, maybe they're from China, wherever, that are going to sites to ingest the information for AI training and inference, not saying who they are, which prevents the website from deciding, do they want to allow that access or not, right? To your point, maybe a lot of folks want the Internet Archive, right? These nonprofits that are dedicated to the preservation of information, they want them to go in. It's a nonprofit. They're not trying to compete with me commercially. Maybe they view a Perplexity a bit different. They view them as, I'm a news website. My job is to provide facts to the world. That's also what you're doing in a different way. You're going to summarize my content such that no one ever visits my website. You're essentially a competitor to me. So nothing wrong with that, but I'm going to block you. And then you stealth crawl to get my stuff anyway. When that happens, it suggests that the standards may not be upheld, right? That all it takes is competitive pressure or the profit motive for these things to collapse, and that there really is no recourse. There's no enforcement mechanism. There's no penalty for noncompliance other than maybe creative legal theories that you brought up earlier. So when that happens, is that not making the case for a law, right? If these are good standards that most people agree are reasonable. And the quote unquote good actor companies acknowledge that they are good standards. What is the harm in passing a law essentially saying that these protocols need to be enforceable and that there need to be penalties for noncompliance? If these are, it's the idea would be like industry is self-regulating, but in order to give that self-regulation some teeth, we need an enforcement mechanism. Is there anything wrong with that from your perspective?
There certainly can be. I mean, I think, or to take a step back, I think there have been a lot of valuable parts to robots.txt effectively being voluntary, even though it was broadly followed and so on, because it then creates the space for those public interest uses like the ones you're talking about to still happen and to not have, law can be a blunt instrument with lots of unintended consequences. So, to reference the Internet Archive again, they generally follow robots.txt, but on some sites they don't because it's a government site or it's some other site where they're an archive, they're a library. It makes sense for them to be a historical record. That's different from the competitive situation you were talking about with sort of a CNN and a Perplexity, I say CNN because they sued Perplexity just this morning, saying exactly the arguments you were just making. I think that's quite different from the sort of thing, with an Internet Archive or Wikimedia or whatnot. I think they're the path forward to me, it would be not starting with the blunt instrument of law, because then you end up with all those unintended consequences. Instead, I think we're in this period of, as you've said, new technology reactions happening, right? And it is a bit of a cat and mouse game at first, right? Companies do one thing, Cloudflare and others come up with ways to block it and back and forth. But my expectation and what I see in the field is, to some extent, despite huge headlines, some of that is leading then to constructive partnership conversations. Let me step out of news and the CNN example for a second. Talk about shopping, where sure, there's litigation between Amazon and Perplexity. Amazon says, Perplexity, I don't like your bot coming to my site. Perplexity says, I'm just giving a shopping agent to your customer who has an Amazon thing, who wants to shop at Amazon. What's the bad thing?
And just to provide some context on this example, and hopefully I'm not throwing you off your train of thought, but because this was something I wanted to bring up, so you read my mind. So Perplexity has an agentic AI. When we say agent, right, an AI that is supposed to act on the user's behalf, to achieve an end that the user wants. It's called Comet, and Perplexity. Do I have this right? They were sending the bot to Amazon to shop. Were they checking out and actually literally buying things? Were they just comparing, shopping? Like, what were they doing that pissed off Amazon?
Yeah. So let's sort of tell a case from both sides.
Yeah.
Amazon says, sure, I want you to shop here, but I want to control how you navigate the site because I need to collect data on how I improve my services. I want to direct your attention to some products versus others that you might like, plus the traffic issues and the engineering I have to deal with, blah, 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 if there's other bots. Okay. On the other hand, Perplexity and folks like EFF and others who've supported them in this litigation note, Comet, which is Perplexity's browser, which has AI built into it, it doesn't cause Perplexity's servers to access Amazon's computers, let alone protected areas of the site. Instead, Comet sits on my browser on my device. It communicates with Amazon servers on my behalf as a consumer. And then that is generally public pages, although when I go to checkout, sure, it's behind, but it's my login. I get that data from Amazon, and then I share it with Perplexity. Say, hey, Perplexity, help me analyze this. And I'm the consumer. Why shouldn't I be able to augment my shopping experience with a bot of my choosing? And that's Perplexity's argument. And I tend to think, on the one hand, all of these folks are companies. So I'm glad you called out, like, everybody says save the open web. And everybody can have a grain of their type of it. And they're all self-interested. So they're all like pulling at this value exchange issue. But, personally, I have a lot of sympathy for the consumer rights angle in this, that shouldn't I be able to do what I want? There's that litigation, but I want to be clear, coming back to your question about where's the role of the law. I don't think law is the best option here, nor do I think it is the inevitable place where this ends, because if we take a step back and we think about shopping, right? Shopping agents and shopping sites, there's a lot of alignment of interests, right? You're trying to sell stuff to consumers, shopping site. I run a bot that will help them buy more stuff. We're aligned. And that's why we start to see lots of APIs and new standards coming out, AI companies and commerce sites saying, here's how the shopping agent works. Basically, creating a front door for the agent to go through. And those sorts of systems might be augmented by identity standards, which might say, hey, I'm a well-behaved bot. Maybe it's about like, hey, I am this company specifically, right? I'm not just saying, Comet is built on the Chrome browser, so it says Chrome, but it says I'm Perplexity. There are some real privacy and anonymity trade-offs there to think about, but these will be in the stew, in the mix, and we should be considering all of them, as well as signals that are about particular uses. Maybe somebody says, I don't want my content crawl for foundation model training, but I still want to be in Google search, with the links, but not in the overviews, right? And that's another thing IETF is working on. So I do have some hope that people, right, there's this disjuncture, people fight, they sue, that people do start to come to the table. And we do get new norms, new standards, new tools with new trade-offs we have to really think carefully about, but we can get a lot of the way there. And not every case will resolve that easily. So what I mean there is like, it really matters where you set the defaults, right? Does Amazon get to say, CFAA, unauthorized access, you're done? Or is the default, Perplexity is let in, and then they negotiate? What's the background condition? To make that a bit more precise, let me give you an example around Google, and I know you followed Google search and the search anti-monopoly case and the remedies there, right? So part of the remedies in the Google search case are Google needs to now create an API to share search result data, and other stuff related to the system with third parties. And the competitor Kagi, that's Kagi, they're one of the ones that hope to be beneficiaries from this API. They're competitors. They've suffered, and they say these remedies could be good. But today, there's no API. So what do I do? Just sit on my hands? No, what Kagi does is they go to a company called SERP API, which looks at Google search results, takes it, puts it in a form where it's interoperable with Kagi, and Kagi can then build on that. And Google has sued SERP API with a different unauthorized access claim saying they're circumventing an access control on this public website. Under what's called the DMCA 1201, generally the thing that's used for ebooks, as I was talking about before, same sort of claim. So, here's the thing. There's no antitrust remedy today. So if you shut down SERP API, Kagi is screwed. And the question is, how much do you trust that antitrust remedy tomorrow? And so I think we need to think very carefully about how we allow what Cory Doctorow and EFF call adversarial interoperability. Where, look, your front door, your API, it's broken. So I'm going to go over here and crawl your site in this other way to help consumers and to help competition. And I think an answer can be not, we need a law, but rather let them fight, in some terms, right? Amazon, Perplexity, play your cat and mouse game. And eventually maybe they come to the table because it's better for both of them to negotiate. Right. And I think that's something we should keep in our minds of not trying to fix everything by law when we can leave that space for other ways to solve things.
No, that was a very thorough and comprehensive answer. So I want to unpack a few things individually. So getting back to the Amazon example, Amazon's a sophisticated company. They're obviously developing AI. They give a ton of money to Anthropic. They run cloud services. They know where the future is headed, right? It would be difficult for me to imagine that Amazon thinks that human beings will never employ agents to shop. Yet what Perplexity says about Amazon, right, at least now, is that their main motivation for blocking or not even blocking, right, but trying to control Perplexity's bots and how they access Amazon is advertising revenue, right? A very similar concern, ironically, to the news publishers, right, to the recipe website, right, to everybody, right? They all say that the deal was when I put this stuff out there, and a human being comes and looks at it, I get some money. Maybe it's not enough. Maybe I don't like the deal that I have, but it's something, right? And what Perplexity is saying is Amazon is not just a company that makes money when you buy something and they take a cut. They also make money when you just look at the screen, right? And you see sponsored battery, sponsored third-party charger, whatever stupid thing you're looking at. And so it's interesting allegation, given that Amazon must know where the world is headed. I'm just curious, Derek, briefly, not to linger on this too much, but do you think that is Amazon's motivation, right? That they're essentially trying to squeeze some juice out of this lemon while it's still there, even though they know that eventually they're going to have to let the bots buy things and that human beings are not going to want to sit there and scroll through 1,000 third-party battery chargers over and over again. Is this just like, while the getting's good, let's get some more? Or do you think they have another motivation for the aggressive tone they've taken with Perplexity, both tone and legally?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And again, just sort of say, and look, I use Amazon. I have an Amazon router. And when I use my Amazon router, there's a ad blocker in there. So Amazon is perfectly happy in some cases giving you some AI to go change somebody else's website, but not here. And the not here is, I think, yes, it is. Sure, their self-interest. They want to, it's not just the ads, they want to rank things in ways that can maximize their profits or maximize their long-term profitability from you as a consumer. On the one hand, nothing inherently wrong with that. That's business. On the other hand, market power, concentration, right? These are the self-preferencing and open marketplace debates we've been having around Amazon and search and Apple. It's very similar. I mean, you can draw a pretty clear analogy between, Amazon's desire for control here. I need interface control. That's what my customers want. That's how I manage security. It sounds a lot like Apple in the App Store. And so your intuitions about the right answer here, I would imagine, probably track more or less those. What's strange here, I note it that way because for some people it doesn't, for reasons I don't quite understand, except AI is this sort of, you put AI on it and people take a totally different view, even within the same company, right? But yeah, I mean, I think it's not that different from Apple saying, I need control over the App Store, I need to control how things ranked, et cetera, or Google with the Play Store for that matter.
Well, and because you mentioned a lawsuit, I guess, that I was unaware of this morning. We're recording this on May 28th, just to orient the viewers and listeners. And Derek mentioned there's some new suit, I guess, CNN against Perplexity, so we'll see how that plays out. And there's also a chance that by the time folks listen to this, that new antitrust, or a version of an old antitrust bill will be reintroduced that actually gets at some of these self-preferencing issues. Now, I don't know if that bill will apply to AI at all, but that'll be something interesting to look at. Now, getting to Google, right, because they have a unique position as what has been ruled, right, as a search monopoly by a judge. And you brought up a couple of interesting questions, both SERP and the monopoly problem. So one of the issues that's come up in the scraping wars, right? If we're going to call it that, maybe that's the title of the episode. I haven't figured that out yet. But is that Google has this unique market power and ability, even in the context of good actors, right? So let's assume that I'm a publisher of whatever it is, doesn't have to be news, and I put up the do not crawl and everyone listens. Google doesn't have to listen for a very important reason, is that Google bundles its search crawler and its Gemini AI crawler. Meaning, if I say no to the AI training, because I view that as a competitive threat, I also then get removed from search entirely. And the way I've described this personally is you're giving certain publishers a choice between a slow and an immediate death, right? The slow death is you let us continue to use your content for AI overviews, which sends less and less traffic to you over time. Or you get an immediate death where you say no to AI training and I just cut you off entirely because I have 90+% market share in search, and not being on Google search for many is a death sentence. Now, the interesting thing here is that this also creates a competitive issue potentially, right? So if I'm a Perplexity or if I'm an OpenAI, publishers can tell me to screw off and it doesn't maybe cost them much, right? The numbers show that AI bots are not referring traffic to publishers, right? So I think one of the stats is, 1 in 14 pages that were crawled, right, by a search bot, there's some traffic. The numbers for AI, it's 1 in several thousand, right? So just orders of magnitude less traffic, according to this data, is being sent to publishers. So AI is not a good source of traffic for publishers, at least as it is today. And so they rely on that old school Google search. So they can tell Perplexity and ChatGPT, you're not worth my time, like block robots.txt. And if they're good actors, they agree. They can't tell that to Google because of Google's market power, and maybe that gives Google an advantage. So one, do you think that that's an antitrust problem that essentially the judge should be updating his decision on? You brought up the remedies. Two, do you think that that advantage incentivizes companies like Perplexity to hide their bots, right? To essentially violate the code of conduct that had upheld for so many years because they're worried about falling behind competitively, right? If Google can just get everything because they basically point a gun at the publisher and say, let us train or you're done, and the others can't do that because they don't have search monopolies, you know, how do you look at that situation? And do we need an antitrust remedy? Because it's not only a competitive problem, it could also incentivize bad behavior.
Yeah. And just to clarify one thing, I think that is the way Google worked at when, sort of the AI boom first, or the generative AI boom, ChatGPT first started. They have sort of moved slightly where you can say, I don't want to be crawled by Google Extended, which is their thing for Gemini and a bunch of other stuff, without disturbing being in search. The thing that you can't do today, though, is say, I want to be in what many of the publishers have called traditional search, a link, a snippet, that's it, versus AI overviews, right? And so it's different than the Gemini part, but still quite, you're spot on in that sense.
For them, that's really the issue.
Yeah,
I think
that's
still more about
still a credible concern.
Yeah.
And there are processes that, that the Competition Markets Authority in the UK has been moving forward with getting Google to create an option to say, I want to be in search, but not in AI overviews. And, that process, so that competition process, that antitrust process is ongoing. And this has been something in the IETF too, where how might we create a signal, not just for Google, but for search generally? We can say, don't crawl my site for foundation model training, but yes, I want to be in search, where search is defined as blank and not blank, right? And not this AI overviews thing. And I do think that you're right that, yes, Google is different. Or I think there, in lots of these cases, we could treat some version of big tech as a distinct problem from the general problem of, hey, you're getting content from my site, but not sending my traffic. How do we make sure that this is good for us and we can both be sustainable? There's a particular problem or challenge with people with more significant market power, and where Google does, yes, have greater visibility of the web and 40 million books that they can train on, basically effectively nobody else can, and YouTube and that creates a different thing. And I think that to circle one thing, I'm not an antitrust scholar, and my instinct is, yes, competition and other parts of media policy are the right lens rather than copyright, which is, copyright is the main event. I don't think necessarily I don't think they're necessarily good arguments when it comes to some of these news cases, both on the foundation model training, but also on the, you're inferencing my site and creating a summary. Perplexity's response to CNN was a little bit too terse of just saying facts aren't copyrightable. And that's true, but more generally, let's remember, newspapers every day copy and summarize other third-party sources without getting a license or paying them. So this is another version of, fair for me, but not for thee. We had the Amazon version earlier. This is the newspaper version. They quote and summarize people all the time. They don't necessarily send back traffic. We need other ways of dealing with the sort of the market power issues and get it out of the copyright space. I don't think copyright is the right lever. And I think we need levers that don't say, hey, consumer, you're not allowed to use an AI to summarize my article anymore or to read aloud, right? Do what we did with ebooks. I think we need something that is more protective of consumer rights than that. And yes, we need to come up with systems where news publishers publish, where they are readily accessible, where they can get value, and the people who help distribute and make them findable get value too. And the more we can focus on that rather than copyright, which is really, it gets the attention because in the US, statutory damages are astronomical. So, if you want to come sue somebody for several $1 billion, you use copyright. You don't use a lot of these other causes of action. I think that when we move beyond the copyright debate, we can get to solutions much quicker.
So let's talk about that, because right now I think it's very understandable that if you believe that your content is valuable and you're not getting paid for it and AI companies are making a lot of money off of it, you're going to turn to the tools that you have, right? And the tool that exists is copyright law. And that's why you're seeing these lawsuits, because what other lever do you have? If the AI companies wanted to negotiate ahead of time for the content, they would have. Now, to be clear, there are a lot of actual licensing deals between AI companies and publishers, because in some cases, the AI companies have acknowledged that, Reuters or Condé Nast or News Corp, whatever, some of these large publishers have a lot of content that is worth paying for, while still arguing in court that they shouldn't have to pay for it, or if they chose not to pay for it, they shouldn't. A lot of folks view it as a hedge against litigation outcomes, so that they don't like get cut off. If a judge just decides to go like crazy and say like delete everything, right? They're not totally cut off. But at the end of the day, Derek, whether it's copyright or not, people need to get paid, right, to work, right? And this is one of the narratives that's in the AI debate. It's not just about disrupting entry-level white-collar work. From the creative community, they're going to say, what is the incentive? Now, a lot of folks, including folks in your community, have said, well, the individuals are going to, if you force AI companies to pay, they're going to get 50 cents, right? It's just not going to be, when there's billions of images out there, the person who took one photograph is just not going to get paid. But at least advertising has historically been a shot that folks had at making money if they hit it big, right? Like if you create a website that blows up, that does really well, you can make a lot of money off of advertising. Or if you decide to paywall, then you can make a lot of money off of subscriptions. It comes down to humanity, right? Like human beings are the reason that those content are valuable. And it's not valuable to have a bunch of bots scrolling around your site that then don't pay you at all. And a lot of folks in copyright, like the copyright skeptic world, I guess I'll call it the copy left, right? If we're being oversimplistic, right? You have the copyright, so to speak, which is like strong IP, like aggressive IP, and then you have the copy left, which is like, we need to reform these laws. The copyright's too strong. The copy left doesn't like things like putting up toll booths, like requiring AI companies to pay every time they access a site, right? They don't necessarily like what Cloudflare is doing. What is the alternative is my question. If it's not copyright, how do you get people to get paid? Because these companies have money to pay people. I find it absurd when folks in big tech land say this would be a burden for AI financially to pay creators. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on data centers, right? They can pay an artist for their work. They can do it. And there's nothing stopping the licensing market from emerging other than their willingness to participate. If they sent a signal out to the world that said, we are willing to pay for content, you bet your ass there would be people trying to build those marketplaces, because it would be very lucrative to be the person that comes up with the mechanism to pay creators for their work, whether that's in bulk, whether that's as a consortium, whether we need to give them an antitrust exemption, whatever. So my question to you is kind of an existential one. If not copyright litigation, what is the mechanism to get people paid so that people have an incentive to do stuff other than just being hobbyists, right? We want people to get paid.
And I think you point to some of it in part of the way you are characterizing it, which part of this is going to be business model evolution. That is already ongoing, or rather, you're right. There are different deals going on and different marketplaces being set up and so on and so forth. And to drill into that a bit more, in a world with strong fair use, where training is fair, et cetera, there will still be the markets that we already see today, where people are paying for access to materials that they could not otherwise get, right? Stuff that's behind a paywall or in the archives of a newspaper that, needs to be digital, whatever. Those deals are already happening for access. And we're seeing people cut deals for uses that, again, even where it would be, there are some uses that are permissible under copyright law, others aren't. So to give an example, right, there have been these deals between newspapers and various different companies, Perplexity, OpenAPI, that allow use of content to display like full content of articles more than a quote, a snippet, right? The thing that might be fair use. That is consistent with deals that have been done in the past. It's consistent with the story of YouTube, right? YouTube, people are mad. All this stuff is on your site. I didn't give you permission. I don't want to send you all these takedowns. YouTube didn't just say, well, you can block it or not. They said, you can block it, or you can leave it up and run ads and we'll share the revenue. And that's what we're seeing with, Suno, Udio, Sora was a version of this. It didn't last, but it's that version of business model of, let's unlock ways for people to remix content, to reuse content in ways that wouldn't be permissible as fair use, like training should be and is. I think those deals are going to come about. And I think they have a lot of promise. Then the question becomes, okay, what problem are we solving for? I think where people should rightly be skeptical of copyright is copyright going to be a solve for a crisis of automation where AI is so good that it can replace creators? No, it's not. The best people can expect is a trickle down of pennies. Most of the money will go to the major media companies. If we're thinking about competition and anti-monopoly policy, the worst thing you could do is require that everything be licensed, because then that is creating a new barrier to entry to everyone not named Google or Meta, right? And again, they already have huge bodies of data that they foreclose from others like YouTube, right? Where they can use YouTube, nobody else can. So, if that's what we're solving for, can't get there from here. I also want to underscore one last thing, which is, yes, there will be deals. These will be a growing market. And so fair use, what it is doing is opened up all these new markets where people will also make money. It is also true that the vast majority of data will never be available to license in any form, period. The vast majority of all works ever created are not actively managed at all. Right? There are over 1 billion websites. Most are not actively managed. Most books are out of print, out of commerce. Most of the 20th century is in copyright, but not actively managed. So, and that's most of the training data. When people say, well, you can just license your way. If you look at like Llama 3, so now a generation ago of data, it would take 316,000 years of New York Times publishing, 316,000 years to get the amount of data that Llama 3 was trained on, right? You're not going to get that. So, as Matt Sag and his co-author put it, in looking at this, like a bunch of cherries doesn't make a sundae. Like, yes, there will be these training deals or these licensing deals or data deals, but those things don't scale. They don't add up to the amount of data you need to train these high performing foundation models. And so that's still going to be something where we need a copyright exception to fit in.
I want to bring up some of the arguments that tech companies have been making that some have characterized as hypocrisy and maybe undermining some of the middle ground potential areas that could lead to win-wins here. So you brought up, right, the Amazon case of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. You brought up the Google and SERP AI case, which was not CFAA, but kind of similar principles of, Google scraped the whole web, didn't ask for permission. This is all in the SERP AI blog, which I read before today. They said, they did all this, right? They scraped the whole internet to build their product, and now they're mad that we're scraping their scraped product, right? The product that was created through scraping is being scraped, and now they're like, you can't do that, right? It's scraping for me, but not for thee. And to many, that might look like hypocrisy from a company like Google. It's like you created your product by just doing whatever you wanted. Now you're mad that someone else is doing the same thing. Similarly, we've seen this other argument against distillation, and a brief description of distillation. You can tell me what I got wrong in your answer, but we saw OpenAI and Anthropic go to Congress, go to the White House and complain that China, DeepSeek, a Chinese AI company, has essentially been misusing American AI products to try to distill or steal, right, their innovation. And the way they do this is they violate the terms of service of the product, right? The terms of service of the product say you can't set up like thousands of bullshit accounts and lob queries and prompts at me and then try to learn from those. Like, you can't do that. If you and I tried to do that, we would get kicked off, right? They would delete our account. But DeepSeek was doing this, and they essentially successfully, right, in late April, the White House said, we see this as a huge problem. And Michael Kratsios, the head of the Office of Science and Tech Policy, said something like, there's nothing innovative about stealing these American innovations. Now, if you're, right, again, a publisher or someone, you might be looking at it like, are you kidding me? Like, that's the exact same thing that I'm saying about what people are doing to me. All right. So it's when a Chinese AI company comes in and lobs queries at my product to try to learn from it, it's distillation and it's wrong. But when an American AI company goes to an American copyright holder and scrapes everything, then it's learning and it's fair use, right? So some folks are going to look at that and say it's hypocrisy. Now, one, I guess, do you think there's merit to that hypocrisy argument? But more importantly, I want to ask you, as someone who's advocating for sensible middle grounds, right? Potentially antitrust as a remedy, interoperability requirements as a remedy, do you think that it hurts the potential for grand bargains if you have companies talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? Saying that what you're doing is unauthorized access, but what I'm doing is authorized access, right? CFAA is a problem over here, but it's not a problem over here, right? If everyone's just going to be hypocrites, which I guess companies are wont to do, does that narrow the window of opportunity for sensible policymaking here?
I certainly, I share your worry, or rather, I spend a lot of my time on policy and trying to think in these principled ways. And I also recognize that politics has a lot of these hypocrisy, contradictions, things people say as a negotiating posture and so on. And so I try to roll with it. But yeah, my intuitions, I think, are similar to what you're stating. I really recommend to people two things on this score. One is Nathan Lambert at the Allen Institute for AI2, did a really long piece on the role of distillation in research and in the improvement of systems and why we should be really careful before, maligning it writ large. Second, Mark Lemley and Peter Henderson co-authored a paper about the enforceability of these terms of service in general, where they note, I think rightly, consistent with the Copyright Office, that these outputs that, you're doing a prompt and the AI system outputs, they're not copyrightable, and you can't use a contract to then lock up this public domain copyrightable thing, particularly for this like pro-competitive reason. It doesn't hang together. And I would be really worried about a world. Again, if I think about this, not just from the competitor standpoint, but as a consumer, I would worry about a world where a publisher has a unilateral right to take a contract. That publisher could be an AI company or a news publisher or whatever. They have a unilateral right to say, sign this contract, and here is granularly what you must do with this thing you created or the book that you're buying, right? I mean, this goes back 100+ years now, where the Supreme Court faced a case where somebody had a book where they put a sticker on it, basically it said, not for resale. And the court said, you can't do that. The law gives the rights to the consumer. That's their property. They can alienate that property. They can sell that property, loan it, whatever they want as they see fit. You don't get to override that with a contract. And I think courts have started to come around more and more to a posture I hope holds, which is different from what we saw in, say, Facebook v. Power Ventures. There's a case where Bright Data, another company that does scraping and crawling and fetching of content for not just AI, but a bunch of things, was sued by Twitter, for, capturing public data. And the court said, wait a second, you can't override the public's rights in copyright with a contract. That's not fair. You get certain rights as a publisher, but the public gets certain rights too. And you can't deprive them of that just with a stroke of a pen. So I do worry about how these arguments get stretched too far. I do worry about that hypocrisy, and that's politics. So I try and make the best of it. But I do think that at least the people where people can be honest about that is helpful. And to be really clear, this is not an argument for do nothing about China, right? So if you want that middle ground could still be, how do we ensure that companies can share threat intelligence signals to protect their servers, whether it's for distillation or exfiltration or whatever? And how do we do that in a way that is good for national security, doesn't violate our antitrust laws? I'm open to that. I'm kind of skeptical that that's going to be a big solve in fighting China, but I'm open to that. I'm less open to this, it's fair for me, but not for thee. And that's the distinction we're making.
All right, final question. You were very generous with your time. So there's a lot of reporting suggesting, right, that this contract is breaking, right, that the open web is going to die, and that there's going to be, bad outcomes from that perspective, right? Creators are going to go behind paywalls. Creators are going to stop creating, right? The symbiosis, however imperfect it was, between, right, Google and the artist, Google and the cooking website is fraying, and whatever replaces it, even if that doesn't mean everyone loses their job or their livelihood, is just not going to be great. Now, you said you're optimistic, so paint me a picture. 5 years from now, is there a symbiotic relationship between artists, creators, individuals, news publishers, etc., people who create content, human beings who create content? Is there a symbiotic relationship between humanity, the creative humanity, and AI companies? And what does that look like?
Yeah. So things I am hopeful about, optimistic about. I do think we will be able to develop standards around, preferences for foundation model training and search and ITF. That process has been going along. I think there will be evolution of identity and standards and APIs in various ways that help like reset the contract and the norms of what we're doing. I think a lot of that will move forward. Where I would say, and I think the business models as a whole for acquiring data, use of data for new uses that are beyond, all that is evolving and will continue to evolve. And I'm optimistic because we watched some of this for the last 20 years where we went from, they said YouTube was only kids on skateboards, and then it was a new medium, and now it's churning out the biggest, horror movie directors of the last 15 years, right? And like, I think we're seeing that vibe shift in Hollywood in general on AI. And so I guess I'm optimistic because I'm in the weeds on some of these solutions and I see them moving forward. They're not totalizing. And I say that in particular, the things I do worry about is not how are things going to shake out between these competing companies. Where's the user? Where's the consumer in this? Where are their rights? How are we protecting them? And how are we sustaining true public goods that the market won't serve, right? I think news companies are going to do fine. They have valuable content. They will put it on a paywall. They will make deals. I worry more about the Wikimedias and the open access repositories of scientific journals and things that the market doesn't necessarily do with as well, including, again, local news that serves the community's needs, not big media companies. Those are things we need to take a very hard look at. How are we actually going to fund and sustain those? Is it going to be taxes, subsidies, tax credits, whatever? I wish there was more focus on that and less on the sort of the sky is falling of it all. The faster we get to those practical solutions, the better.
We will leave it there. Derek Slater is a founding partner of Proteus Strategies. He spent 15 years at Google, where during that time, he built and ran the information policy team. Before that, he was at two organizations that think a lot about these issues, Electronic Frontier Foundation and Harvard's Berkman Center. Derek, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thank you. Happy to.
We will link to Derek's writing. There's a lot of it, so I'll pick a couple examples in the show notes for today. But I had a lot of great conversations with Derek over the past few months. I think he's really thoughtful, and I appreciate him coming on the show. This is the Center Edge. This podcast is sponsored by Digital Progress Institute. It is produced by Vulgate Media. If you're an AI company and you want to train on my content, please do. Just tell people about it. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us a review. It will help others find the show. You can shoot me an email at evan@corepointstrategies.com with any suggestions, feedback, ideas for guests. You want to pitch yourself, whatever you want to say. Otherwise, we will catch you next time.